I don't think any political party has ever been able to raise that much money in such a short period of time. And I think it terrified Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland.
Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everyone. I'm Cypher.
And I'm Fox. The Liberals have officially filed their appeal to challenge Judge Mosley's recent decision that the federal government's invocation of the Emergencies Act was unjustified and unreasonable. In addition, Chris Barber has decided to take on his own fight against the federal government itself.
Let's get into it. In a National Post article that dropped yesterday, it reads,
Ottawa has filed to appeal a federal court decision that found its invocation of the Emergencies Act in response to the 2022 Freedom Convoy protests was unjustified. The government is asking the Federal Court of Appeal to overturn a January decision that found the government's use of emergency law led to the infringement of constitutional rights. The federal Liberals invoked emergency powers in response to thousands of protesters who entrenched themselves in downtown Ottawa for weeks in spin-off protests that blockaded border crossings. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association and others argued in court that Ottawa ushered in the emergency measures without sound statutory grounds. Federal Court Justice Richard Mosley's decision, which the Liberals immediately promised to appeal, differed from the conclusion of the Public Order Emergency Commission.
That inquiry found the government met the very high legal standard for using the law. In the documents filed Thursday, the government outlined arguments including that the federal court erred by reviewing the decision to invoke the act, quote, with the benefit of hindsight, end quote, and based on information not available to the government in 2022. The court also made a mistake in substituting its own opinion about the decision the government should have made, it said. Instead, it said the court should have looked at whether it was reasonable for the government to, quote, decide that it had reasonable grounds to believe, end quote, that a public order emergency existed and needed to be dealt with through special temporary measures. The court was also wrong to decide the invocation of the Emergencies Act was a violation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the government argued.
That last thing is pretty significant for the government to say. Right. I would think.
And they, no argument and justification made it into the news article, even though there was, other arguments and justifications for the other claims. But the one thing I would say is this is all going to come down to whether the government was justified in meeting the criteria outlined in the SUES Act of whether there was an actual threat to Canada. And as Judge Mosley, pretty much put an airtight ring around this, they didn't. Justin Trudeau tried to come up with this new term called economic threat, and that is not defined as a threat to the country in the SUES Act, which is what is in the Emergencies Act as justification for invoking it in the first place.
Well, and the thing I understand about this appeal, and any appeal, is that the court doesn't have to hear it. They could look at the justifications and go, no, that's not good enough, and just throw the whole thing out, and Judge Mosley's ruling will stand.
Correct. The first thing that the government has to convince the Federal Appeal Court to do is actually hear the case. So Fox is right on here. So the Federal Appeal Court could take a look at the initial arguments and say, no, we're not even going to take a look at this. You're done. And then it's actually dead in the water. No more appeal. If the Federal Appeal Court does decide to take a look at it, then they will hear the arguments and then they will render their decision. And that's going to be months and months later. If the Federal Appeal Court agrees with the government, then the original organizations, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and the Canadian Constitutional Foundation and those parties, they could appeal that decision. And then that goes up to the Supreme Court. And then if the Supreme Court decides those arguments are without merit, then it'll stop there. Or if they decide that it is with merit, then they will then review the decision. So this is how the process is going to work. So it's all going to depend, if the Federal Court of Appeals even hears the case, And if they do, then are they even going to agree with it? Now, normally courts don't like overturning the ruling of their judges. And I don't say they like or dislike it as in, a desire to. It's that they try to uphold the system.
Because they trust what their judges have ruled is correct and that the judges know what they're doing.
Right. So there has to be a very, very strong argument to actually, A, go forward with the appeal, and B, overturn the decision. And there's going to be so many things that are, I think, working against the Liberals on this. A, it was a Liberal-appointed judge, number one. B, the Liberal-appointed judge at the outset said, yeah, I didn't think I was going to come to this decision. Now, their argument of, well, with the benefit of hindsight and, the judge saw information not available to the government in 2022. Sure, there might be something there. But again, this is all going to come back down to a linchpin. And that is, in the Emergencies Act, it defines a threat to national security. And that threat is defined in the SUES Act. And we went through this actually on our previous video, which will be in the description if you want to look at the deep dive of our decision here. So because the Emergencies Act actually references an external definition of what a threat to national security is, it's very, very well defined. Now, people can agree with it or not, but it doesn't matter. It actually has to meet that definition to be able to invoke the Emergencies Act. And Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland and the rest of them were calling this an economic threat. That is not in the SUES Act. And that's basically what Judge Mosley was saying. So unless you meet that criteria, you can't even invoke the act. It doesn't matter what you think, and it doesn't matter what information you have. And one of the big problems that I see here is that the government is arguing that the judge should have said, well, you should have decided that, the government had reasonable grounds to believe that a public order emergency existed and it needed to be dealt with through special temporary measures. Sure, special temporary measures are fine, not the Emergencies Act, because you did not meet the threshold criteria to deal with it. So that's going to be a big problem, I think, for the Liberals, and I don't really like their chances on this. And in talking with Diane Sylvain, who was on our channel a couple of weeks ago, and she has a lot more expertise in this than Fox or I, she seemed to have a similar opinion. So that will be interesting to see how this plays out over the next number of months.
So in addition to all of this, Chris Barber is suing the federal government for freezing bank accounts as a result of using the Emergencies Act. Chris Barber, who owns a trucking company in southwestern Saskatchewan, filed last week a statement of claim in Court of King's Bench in Saskatoon, claiming the federal government's unprecedented move to invoke the act constituted an abuse of power. Quote, this disruption deprived Barber and his wife of the ability to conduct basic financial transactions and live normal lives, leading to severe inconvenience, hardship, embarrassment, exclusion from modern society, and damaged personal and business relationships, end quote, says the claim, which also names his wife and trucking business as plaintiffs.
The statement of claim says all of Barber's personal and business bank accounts were frozen the next day without notice. He couldn't withdraw cash, deposit money, or use credit cards, and automatic payments were blocked, it says. One account was frozen for 9 days and another was blocked until the next month, the document says. Barber couldn't access money for daily living expenses like food, fuel, or medicine, says the lawsuit. He also, quote, suffered and experienced fear and anxiety due to the anticipated loss of income, end quote, because his salary, wage, and business revenue payments were going to the frozen account, it says. That resulted in missed payments and defaults on loans and credit card bills, damaging his credit score, the document says. Barber is still being rejected for business funding applications and has been told his bank accounts will be, quote, marred indefinitely, end quote, says the lawsuit. It alleges the federal government froze bank accounts for the, quote, improper purpose of dissuading and punishing, end quote, protesters for exercising fundamental charter rights.
So after speaking with several other folks in this community, in this conservative community. It seems to me what had happened was that once the GoFundMe got shut down, Give, Send, Go was depositing funds directly into the bank accounts of the organizers of the Freedom Convoy. And there was no way for the government to intervene and stop Give, Send, Go from doing that. They had attempted to do so, but were unsuccessful. Instead, what the federal government did was invoke this Emergencies Act and then unlawfully shut down the bank accounts of the protest organizers so that they could no longer receive funds from donors. They received something like $20 million within just a few weeks. I don't think any political party has ever been able to raise that much money in such a short period of time. And I think it terrified Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland.
Oh, I think so. And the problem is you had the Liberals saying that this was, all this funding was coming from foreign actors in Russia and terrorist groups and all this stuff, when more than 80% of the total funds were actually coming from normal Canadians, with the remainder coming from, other countries, most of which was from the United States.
Well, and again, it was just normal, regular people who saw what was going on in Canada and decided that they wanted to financially support it too.
Well, the interesting thing is when the federal government did try to actually block Give, Send, Go, they tried to actually go through the United States federal government, and the United States federal government told them to piss off because they're like, no.
You have no right.
You have no jurisdiction here. This is a United States-based company. And you can't prove there's any wrongdoing in here. And even so, that's against our constitutional rights. So why would we do that? So, this was the only way they could approach this. And the timing of this is not a coincidence, because no doubt Chris was looking at the decision from Judge Mosley, and because Judge Mosley declared that the economic action, which is the freezing of bank accounts, and the Emergencies Act was declared unreasonable, he saw an avenue to be able to sue the government, because two of the plaintiffs that were in that lawsuit won, and are in the process of being having the damages decided. So absolutely, Chris has a right to do this. And there's actually, one other person who's going to be suing alongside Chris in her own lawsuit, named Laura Lee Mizzou. So really, anyone who had their bank account frozen by this act, based on Judge Mosley's decision, has a good chance of actually winning a lawsuit against the government at this point.
Because the government's not supposed to be invoking the Emergency Act specifically to freeze bank accounts, which is almost certainly what they did in this case. I mean, that was almost certainly one of the driving factors for invoking the act. What they're supposed to do, for example, say that they think I'm money laundering or something, they're supposed to get a warrant. They're supposed to provide a judge with enough evidence so that the judge goes, yeah, okay, let's give the government a warrant, or the police, it should be in this case, to shut down Fox's bank account because she's clearly laundering money. That's how you're supposed to do it. That's due process. What they did was, again, like Cypher said, they tried to go through the states. The states told them where to go. You know what I mean? And so they said, okay, well, I guess we should invoke this Emergencies Act, and that will give us the power that we need to shut down these bank accounts unlawfully.
So it's very interesting that at the same time that the Liberal government is trying to appeal this decision, you have Chris Barber, who's been a victim of, just a political stunt by Justin Trudeau and the federal government in this trial that him and Tamara Lich are involved in, and he's launching his own fight, and good for him, because this was ridiculous. And again, you don't have to agree with the truckers. You don't have to agree with what their message is. The facts is that the government was unjustified in using the Emergencies Act, which means it was unlawful to actually have them freeze these bank accounts and violate the rights of these Canadians.